Back in 1999, the national debt was only $5.5 trillion, and Bill Clinton stood before the nation in the State of the Union and projected a rosy fiscal outlook. Take a listen.
From a deficit of $290 billion in 1992, we had a surplus of $70 billion last year, and now we are on course for budget surpluses for the next 25 years.
So in 1999, Bill Clinton predicted budget surpluses for the next 25 years. Yet here we are 24 years later, and not only has the national debt not been spent down, but it's ballooned to a stratospheric $31 trillion. So all of this leads us to ask, what happened in those intervening years, and where do we lay the blame? In today's video, we'll go backwards in time to see exactly how our nation's debt load burgeoned over time. All of this began when President Bush took office. Those Clinton surpluses quickly disappeared for a couple of big reasons. The first is the nation started pouring more money into the military again in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And then President Bush launched long and expensive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and unlike previous presidents, he didn't pay for those wars with war bonds or by raising taxes. He borrowed the money. On top of that, President Bush cut taxes in 2001 and 2003, and because he didn't accompany those tax cuts with commensurate reductions in spending, it led to more budget deficits and more borrowing. But then in 2003, we got the real budget buster. Former Comptroller General of the federal government, David Walker, explains on 60 Minutes.
The prescription drug bill was probably the most fiscally irresponsible piece of legislation since the 1960s. The
Why?
imbalance, well, because we've promised way more that we can afford to keep. $8 trillion added to what was already a $15 to $20 trillion underfunding. We're not being realistic. We can't afford the promises we've already made, much less to be able to piling on top of them.
With one stroke of the pen, Walker says the federal government increased existing Medicare obligations nearly 40% over the next 75 years.
We'd have to have $8 trillion today invested at Treasury rates to deliver on that promise.
And how much do we have?
Zip.
So with a stroke of a pen, President Bush added trillions of dollars to a debt trajectory that was already spiraling out of control. And then, in 2008, at the very end of President Bush's term, the financial crisis hit and the economy went into cardiac arrest.
I think this is the most significant financial crisis in the post-war period.
There are fears the sell-off will continue on Wall Street.
Soaring gas prices, falling home prices, and rising unemployment.
What kind of recipe is that? Overall, that's a recipe for a recession.
2008 was a bad dream. It was a bloody year on Wall Street and a real capitulation for a system run amok.
So the net result of Bush's 2 terms in office is that he arrived to a budget surplus and left office having added trillions to the national debt. So then Obama gets elected in 2008, and what does he do to the national debt? He grows it even more. The first thing he had to do was kickstart the economy in the wake of the 2008 financial meltdown. He signed into law the Economic Recovery Act that cost the nation almost $1 trillion.
The budget I submitted to Congress will build our economic recovery on a stronger foundation so that we don't face another crisis like this 10 or 20 years from now.
And over the next couple of years, he kept spending money on social safety nets such as food stamps to help the unemployed and to gird up the flagging economy. And he did so by adding trillions more to the national debt. The other thing that Obama continued to fund was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he did that with borrowed dollars. The last thing that Obama did, which escapes many people's memory, is that he made a deal with Republicans to make 80% of the Bush tax cuts permanent. And that amplified the growth of the debt for decades to come. Keep in mind, I'm generally a fan of tax cuts so long as they're accompanied by a commensurate cut in spending. But that's not what happened during Obama's administration. So Obama left office having added trillions to the national debt, in part because of circumstances he inherited, but in part because of his own profligate spending decisions. And then President Trump takes office.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
And there are 2 big things President Trump does to dramatically increase the debt. The first is that, like President Bush before him, he cuts taxes without a commensurate cut in spending. The second thing that President Trump had to do was respond to the economic recession that was precipitated by the COVID-19 global pandemic. And how much did the government spend to bail out our country? Roughly $5 trillion went to households, small businesses, restaurants, airlines. hospitals, local governments, schools, and other institutions around the country who were affected by the pandemic. And all that debt spending happened on President Trump's watch. So then President Biden takes office and spends another $2 trillion in a last effort to shock the economy back into normalcy. That stimulus was likewise not covered by increased taxes, but by borrowing more money. So, after 23 years of unprecedented levels of spending that has driven our nation to the fiscal brink, where should we lay the blame? Was one party more culpable than the other? Well, if you go to the Treasury Department website, you can add up how much debt was added under each president during their time in office. And if you do it for every year since 2000, and you break it down by party, you find that between Democrats and Republicans, it's basically a tie. When you add up all the debt that was accumulated under President Bush and then under President Trump, the two Republicans, it comes out to $12.7 trillion. And then if you add up all the debt accumulated under President Obama and President Biden, the two Democrats, that comes to about $13 trillion. You take the nation's $5.5 trillion of debt in 2000 and add it to what those four presidents layered on during their administrations, and that leaves us with the $31 trillion in debt we have today. Now, all that said, we should be cautious when it comes to these types of comparisons, and that's because policies often transcend presidencies. Policies enacted during one presidency don't just stop once a new president takes office. If you pass an 8-year tax cut and don't make commensurate cuts in spending, the impact of those decisions persists into the next president's administration. In summary, both Republicans and Democrats have a proven history of profligate debt spending that will lead to dire consequences if not addressed. It's a bipartisan problem which calls for a bipartisan solution. In order to stem the tide of that growing debt, Republicans and Democrats will have to come together and make tough decisions about future spending, particularly when it comes to entitlement programs, the principal driver of future debt. And every year that goes by where they fail to make these tough decisions means the day of reckoning for our country will come all the more quickly, and the reality of future tax increases will be all the more certain. One last observation of my own: if you have huge amounts of retirement savings in tax-deferred accounts, like 401ks and IRAs, then you're in a very precarious position. In his best-selling book, Come Back America, former Comptroller General of the federal government, David Walker, predicted that average effective tax rates will have to rise to 45% by 2030 to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. That's essentially a doubling of individual tax rates. So how much of your retirement savings will you get to keep? Well, according to David Walker, only about half, which is why it's so important that you have a plan to get to the 0% tax bracket by the time you retire. Why is the 0% tax bracket so important? Because if tax rates double, as David Walker has predicted, 2 times 0 is still 0, and that's what I call the power zero. If you want to learn how to shield your retirement savings from a potential doubling of tax rates within the next 10 years, be sure to check out my tax-free toolkit. You can download it for free at taxfreetoolkit.com. If you're a financial professional and want to learn how to become a certified Power Zero advisor, head over to powerzero.com and opt into my free 3-part video series. By the way, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop them into the comment section below. I respond to every single one of them personally. And don't forget to click like, subscribe, and the bell so you never miss a video. This is Dave McKnight. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.